Welcome to the Oxa podcast, where we discuss science-based breathing tools and practices to optimize your health. Hi, everyone. I'm your host, Matthew Chafford, biomedical engineer and health tech podcaster. Our guest today is Jesse Coomer, who is a human performance specialist, author, and co-founder of the Breathwork Tactics program. In this conversation, Jesse shares his personal journey towards living a longer, healthier life after decades spent dealing with social anxiety through unhealthy coping mechanisms, including drugs and alcohol use. He explains how breathwork has helped him reconnect with his emotions, get his subconscious under control, and how it led him to healthier daily decisions. We talk about the connection between breathwork, psychology, and longevity, and how breathing practices like the physiological sigh, the 4-7-8 technique, and many others can lead to healthier daily decisions with a long-term and net positive outcome on our longevity. By the end of this episode, you will know simple breathing techniques that you can use to make healthier lifestyle decisions day after day. Before we jump right in, I'd like to add that this episode is brought to you by Oxa, the first breathing wearable with live biofeedback and your coach for enhanced sleep and stress relief. Oxa measures in real time your vitals, like your heart and respiratory rates, and creates personalized breathing exercises for you to get better sleep and control stress. Head over to oxalife.com for more details on how Oxa can help you live a healthier life. And now, here's our conversation with Jesse Coomer. So can you share with us your personal journey with breathwork, Jesse? Because to hear what took you, there, and what initially drew you to this practice.
When it comes to breathwork for me, it really all started with my youth. I am a combination of a person who is an extreme extrovert, and also I've always struggled with social anxiety. And so for me, I wasn't aware of why I felt the way I felt. Later on, I found out that, a lot of the frustration, a lot of the stress and anxiety I felt as a young man, that was there for a reason. That was there to actually help me to do something with my life and make something out of myself. But I just felt it as, hey, this is uncomfortable. This is something I want this to stop.
Yeah, to get rid of it.
I did what a lot of people do. I tried to drown out those signals, and I used drugs and alcohol. And basically, I was an incredibly unhealthy person for the vast majority of my young life. And it wasn't until I was about my late 20s, I would say 27, 28, somewhere around there, that I realized this strategy is just not working. It works at first. I'll admit that at first, it really, really did the job. But the thing is, ultimately, and then later on, I found out that you can try to drown out your emotions. You can try to drown out a lot of these things, but they're not going away. And they're there for a real reason. And if you're not addressing them and you're not listening to them, it's not like things get better magically on their own. So ultimately, I started in my late 20s. That was also when I went back to school. I wanted to become an English professor. I wanted to do something different. And so I just did a whole big change in my life. And so at this point, I started doing these crazy things I had heard about, like exercise. And up until this point, I was like, why would you do exercise? You get all sweaty and sore and it sucks. I was always focused on the immediate discomfort, and I just wanted to run away from that as much as I could. So I started to get into exercise, and I started to do a lot of these things that I had heard would help with stress and anxiety. And I tried to give them a chance. And hey, wouldn't you know it, things started to get better. And I started to notice that, I feel better. I even look better in the mirror. And there's so many wonderful benefits. And I let go of the drugs and alcohol and made a major change in my life. And I started at the age of 30. I became an English professor, and I was exercising and all these things, but I'd never really found a way to really sit with my emotions and really be with myself and be calm. And a friend of mine introduced me to meditation. And so I thought, okay, I will try this as well. And so I sat down, I closed my eyes, and I decided I'm going to meditate as long as I can. And 5 seconds later, I opened my eyes and I was like, well, wait a minute, that was just 5 seconds, right? So I realized that I needed to do something about this overthinking, this rumination that had really been at the root of my issues my entire life. And so I started to go down the rabbit hole of, okay, how do I become a better meditator? How can I sit with my emotions better? And that's what led me to, at first, I got into yogic breathing, so pranayama. And then from there, I got into a lot of different styles of breath work. So I started with Wim Hof, and I worked with him and did some things in that organization for a while. I started doing what any nerd would do, and I started just going down the rabbit hole of all these different modalities, these different philosophies and principles, and these different opinions on what is actually happening when we change our breathing on our own. That led me to where I am today, that I published my first book, A Practical Guide to Breathwork, which all the things, whenever I do something, it's most of the time, it's what I wish would have been there whenever I was going through it, whenever I was younger. And so I published that in 2020. And then later on, really started to learn a lot more about how our psychology works and how that plays a role and how our breathing plays a role in that relationship. And that's where the language of breath all came from. And here I am today teaching other people how to do it. So ultimately, it came from a great need. And now I'm here, hopefully helping people and being the person that I wish would have been there for me whenever I was going through it.
Thanks for sharing that. It's very inspiring stories. It's interesting. It reminds me of we did an episode with Ben Bidwell, I think it was episode 6, that was on emotional intelligence. And he also had a very particular story as to, how he got into breath work, because he had, I think, in a way, a similar issue as you had, where he could not actually, just stand with his own emotions. And he also got to learn that, I think, close to his 30s. So you guys share a similar story. So you mentioned that you changed your way of life in a way, your lifestyle. You started exercising, you started meditation, breath work. You mentioned that you eventually got better. The topic would like to, cover in the conversation today and understand a bit, what's the interlink between breath work and that aspect of the human body's longevity. And so before we go, let's say in the, the practicalities of which, how breath work actually influences that, I'd be curious to hear, from you, how do you define longevity? I understand there's a health span aspect. So like the amount of time we can stay in a sane body, versus, let's say, how long we live, including years where we are maybe sick or, not in the perfect shape. So yeah, I'd be curious to hear how you conceptualize it, how you define it.
Yeah, when it comes to longevity, this is philosophically, it's an interesting issue because, there's the whole thing. Well, do you want to live forever? And all of these other questions that sort of come in there if you think about it long enough. And there are a lot of people who that's the goal, is just completely just beat the clock. And of course, even if you were able to do that, you could still get hit by a car tomorrow and die, right? So there's this whole, I think there are a lot of different things that come up when we talk about longevity. And for me, though, I want to live as long as I can live healthfully. And that would not just be, okay, I would like to live, 80 years and then, hey, at 80 good years and I'm done. I would love to see what 100 looks like. I would love to see what, those higher numbers look like. At the same time, I want to make sure that my health is there to help me see those years well. And it's so important, there's the saying that, you might feel like you have a million different problems, but when you're sick, you really only have one. And so I want to go through my life and live a long, healthy life. I would love to see my great-grandchildren, at least see my grandchildren, right? And be able to be as useful as I can for as long as I can. I don't have any desire to be, a vampire, living forever and all these things. But I think it's reasonable to say that we all want to postpone the inevitable as long as we can, and as long as we can do it in a way that is keeping us, feeling good and making it so that we are actually happy to continue waking up in the morning. So I'm not the kind of person who's just trying to live forever, but I do want to live well as long as I live. If a person says, how long would you like to live? It's a difficult question, when especially asking me at this age, if you ask me at maybe I live to be 100. How long would you like to live? I might give a different answer. I want to be able to be present, be useful. I don't want to be a burden on my loved ones. I want to be able to wake up each morning happy that I actually did wake up.
Awesome. Could you, explain us the sort of like the science behind how breathwork can actually impact, longevity and our health span, our ability to stay healthy longer, as you mentioned?
This is where there's a few different ways we can take the conversation, right? I would say most of the time this conversation would go down, how are we affecting mechanisms within our physiology? And that's cool and all. But at the end of the day, the thing that affects your life the most, okay, is those little decisions you make each and every day. And the decisions that we make are absolutely influenced by our psychological state. And so one of the things that I talk about with my students when I train breath workers in the language of breath philosophy, we focus on the whole individual. And we really focus on the fact that we often see ourselves as just this one, okay, you've got this conscious thinking mind, and then you've got this body, right? But we try to focus on the fact that most of the thinking that happens at an unconscious level. So we have this conscious experience that really is very small compared to our complete experience. And then the vast majority of who we are, what we are, all those things that make us me and make you happen at an unconscious level. And it's this interaction between these two aspects of you that create our lived experience. And it's very important, just this foundational understanding, kind of a paradigm shift, because we often will look at ourselves almost like a machine operator, right? Especially when we look at longevity, it's this machine operator. I'm up here and I've got these gears and levers and things like that. And then there's this machine that it's kind of like this flesh robot that I drive around, and I'm trying to make sure it doesn't break down, and maybe I'll have to replace a few parts. And we see ourselves like that. And that's a metaphor that we use to describe the human condition. And it works in a lot of ways. There are many times when we use the metaphor so much that we forget what we're actually describing with the metaphor. And so at all times, okay, and so ride with me here for just a minute, because I know this doesn't just say, okay, sirtuins, DNA. I know that's where we're going there. We're going there, but I want to really give how I think breathwork is so foundational to longevity. So we need a little bit of background, and this is a little bit of the philosophy that I bring whenever I train people. And ultimately, we are at all times we're taking in about 11 million pieces of information, and that's a lot. But we can only consciously process about 40 to 50 pieces of information at a time. So the vast majority of the information that we're taking in, we are processing on an unconscious level. And it is this unconscious you that is responsible for all of your bodily functions, all of these things, our cell replication, all of these things that when we think about, okay, let's take medicine or let's do supplementation or those biological functions, that is what actually controls that. We can add things into the mix through, medicines, supplementation, diet, things like that. But ultimately, the unconscious you is what makes all of these things work. It's what determines how they are used. And it's the thing that it's a part of you. It's not just a part of you. It is you. One of the things that I always remind people, and I have a lot of clients from a lot of different areas, my students have clients from all sorts of different walks of life, is that we are organisms of action. And I'm getting there. I promise I'm getting there. I just want to cover these things. So when the unconscious you has a belief about your environment or your situation, it will make physiological changes based off of the immediate moment. So this unconscious you that controls all of it just controls everything. It doesn't know about the future. It has no desire to live to be 102. It is only concerned with the present moment. And it literally cannot think about the present or anything except for the present. Consciously, I can think about the present. This rational part of my brain, I can think about the present. I can think about the future. I can think about things that happened in my past. But the unconscious you, which is most of us, most of what a human is, it cannot do that. It's only concerned with the present moment, and it's trying to move you toward actions in the present moment that it believes will let you survive the present moment. It's not concerned with longevity. And so if our goal is longevity, we have to learn to live with the fact that the vast majority of what we are is not concerned with longevity. It's concerned with longevity to, I guess, a degree, but it's just this present moment. And so what we see when we have for instance, sometimes we have disagreements or we have a mismatch between my desire for something to happen in the future versus this unconscious that is only concerned with the present. And for me, it was rumination. So rumination affects, I would say, most people, some of us more than others. I myself, my joke is that if rumination were an Olympic sport, I would have all the medals. And so naturally, this is one of the reasons that I got into breathwork, because I was looking for a way to work with this. But what rumination is, and I think it's always important to understand what it is we're actually discussing, what is it we're actually experiencing. That is when you think about something consciously, something that maybe happened in the past or something that it will happen in the future. And when you do that, the unconscious again, it doesn't know, okay, well, tomorrow I need energy to take some kind of action about that, or I can't do anything about it right now. A lot of times you're laying in bed and, you're thinking about this thing and your unconscious is giving you all this energy, right? And that's ultimately what stress is. It's energy for the present moment to take some kind of action for your survival in the present moment, which no one ever told me about this. This is one of those things that I don't think we explain this very well, what the stress response is, but that's what it is. It is energy in the present moment that is there to try to help you to survive or to thrive in the present moment. But you might be thinking about something tomorrow. And it's not always something negative. It sometimes is that you're very excited about something. Meanwhile, you're losing sleep, which, as we know, is one of the most foundational elements of our health, right? And so when we start to understand what we are more effectively, when we really start to understand what we are, we can start to work with ourselves to ameliorate many of the problems that we have that over time shorten our lifespans, shorten our health spans, and make it so that we don't want to wake up in the morning, right? That causes all this suffering. And so understanding, okay, so what I'm not this machine operator. I am 37.2 trillion cells that are all trying to work together to survive and thrive on planet Earth. And I experience this consciously and unconsciously. And my unconscious experience, I can't control it. And it's affecting how I feel. It's affecting the way that my physiology is expressed. It's affecting how I digest food. It's affecting how I sleep. It's affecting the decisions that I make. And we'll unpack all of this today. But when we talk about what really helps us to live a longer and healthier life, it is these little decisions. It's, you make this big decision. I'm going to buy a Nordic track, or I'm going to get this, whatever it is, but it makes no difference. That big decision is useless unless you make a little decision every single day. I'm going to do the 30 minutes of zone 2 cardio, And so I think the thing that we love to talk about is parsing out things from research that oftentimes we're sort of parsing it out and hoping that it says what we want it to say. But we all know the thing that is so true. And it's that if you exercise regularly, your longevity increases. If you eat healthy foods, your longevity increases. If you sleep well, if you can just do those three things, right? And so what breathwork can do is it can put us in a position where we do the things we know for a fact. We know beyond a shadow of a doubt, these things lead to better outcomes. And once we start to understand how our psychology works, then we can start to work with it. And that's where breathwork comes into play. Because, sadly enough, when you don't feel safe, or when you're more stressed, or when things are a little bit harder, you're going through a little bit more difficult time, isn't it strange? And I would ask you, I'm sure we could all relate to this. Those are the times you actually need to be treating yourself better, right? Those are the times you need more sleep because you're going through more, you're expending more energy. Those are the times you need to eat more healthfully. You're working through all those minerals, that's really crucial that you're giving yourself the right nutrition, the right sleep, all these good things. But what happens? Well, those are the times we drink more, we caffeinate more, we tend to eat more pizza. And hey, nothing against pizza. I love my pizza, but it's usually when we get the junk food, And we are treating ourselves worse during those times. And those have long-term outcomes that make a difference years, decades later. And that is, I think, yes, we love talking about a lot of the data that we have, but we have to understand that the real data, the hardest data, the fullest data comes down to how are you living your life? What are the decisions you're making on a regular basis? And are you doing those solid three? Eat well, exercise, sleep. That's the foundation of longevity. And, there are a lot of other things that we know that we should be doing, but the psychology is the big thing. So for instance, and I'm sorry for just going on and on, but I'm excited. And when I get excited, that's whenever I love to share. So one of the things we know is that we need those consistent wins, and those consistent wins generally lead to bigger wins. So for me, going back to my story, if I would have stayed on my trajectory, right? Okay, I'm not going to exercise. I'm going to use drugs and alcohol for all my problems. I'm going to run away from all discomfort, never eat right. I mean, here in the United States, we have way more processed foods than you guys have. But even still, there's some processed foods that are just like, even we in the United States are like, that is just poison. And so I was eating all of those. And so think of the trajectory there. Now, when I started getting into exercise, eating better, there is a huge mindset change that has to happen. And much of that mindset shift is when I work with people now, we use breathwork to help work with the psychological aspects of behavior change. And so, for instance, we know that when you give a person like wins, regular wins over time, a person is more likely to continue down that path. And this has been proven in multiple arenas. The one I'm thinking of right now, there's in the United States, and you might have heard of him, there's this guy named Dave Ramsey, and he talks about financial freedom and people getting out of debt. One of the pieces of advice that he gives is really, it doesn't make sense, but it works because of the psychology of behavior change. And it's this. He says, okay, take a look at all of the debt that you have. If you're trying to get out of debt, you look at all this debt that you have. And regardless, naturally, the reasonable thing to do is to pay off whatever debt you have where you have the highest interest rate, right? That actually makes more logical sense. Pay off the debt that you have that has the highest interest rate because that's what's costing you the most. It's causing you to be in debt the most. But what he found, and there's an enormous amount of, it's fun, the data continues to show, if you give, what he says is, don't do that. What you want to do is pay off whatever debt you have that's the smallest amount of debt. And what that does is it gives you little wins. And what he's consistently shown, and we see it in all sorts of different ways of behavior change, if you give yourself those little wins, you're more likely to complete the goal rather than you'd go about it in the really, really most methodical, logical way. Someone could have come to me when I was making my life change, and they could have said, well, what you need to do is 30 minutes of cardio 5 days a week. You need to have a diet that consists of these XYZ macros, and you need to throw in some weight training. Make sure you go to sleep at this regular time, wake up at this regular time. For me at that time, that would have been too big of a lift. I was excited that I went to the gym for 15 minutes. My wife still teases me about this. She's like, oh, I remember when you were starting, you'd go 15 minutes and you'd come back. You're like, whoa, I really pushed it today, But what happened is, because of those little wins, they lead to bigger wins. And those bigger wins lead to even bigger wins. And before you know it, you've developed a lifestyle that leads to longevity, that leads to better health span and a better overall outlook in life, because you've started to train yourself, not only physically, because that's not everything. You've trained yourself to see yourself as a person who does these things, right? That unconscious you is always watching. And we call this implicit learning. It's the learning that we do without trying to learn. And you have to show yourself to be a consistent decision maker, and making those better decisions on a regular basis is the only thing that convinces you that you can do it and keep going. So I know that's a long way of saying it, but I want to make it very clear that while there are very exciting things in the world of nutrition, breathwork, etc., that point to possible outcomes that we could see, what I want to remind everyone of is that the basics are what's going to get you the longevity. And we haven't really been studying, like we don't have actual long-term research with regards to, okay, if a person does this style of breath work, they live to be 100 years.
For sure.
Here in the West, we're just like, breath work? Awesome. I mean, think about this podcast is not very old, right? We're just now starting to really recognize, wow, this is profound. This is going to have amazing outcomes. So if we can use breath work, I think the most profound benefits that we're going to get is we're going to find out more things as we go, but reinforcing what we already know for sure, that's your best overall investment.
I think everyone agrees, that, if you have a very strong, maybe daily breathwork practice and the rest of your lifestyle is garbage, you might not get the outcomes that we mentioned. But so I'd be curious to hear, from you when we think about breathwork as a way to compensate for that, let's say, subconscious mind that tells us, and that's very action oriented, present focused, not really caring about the future or the past. How does that help us to make that connection and, in the end, influence the way we make decisions on a daily basis that are going to make a big impact and difference on the long term?
And this is what I find to be so exciting because you see immediate benefits and long-term benefits. This beautiful thing, a friend of mine once said that breathwork is the one thing that affects everything. I love that because where our decision-making happens. So we have to understand the unconscious you. And so this is so much of you, right? So much of you, all these different processes that are beyond conscious control. Okay, so that's the vast majority of what's happening in our brains, in our physiology, our entire nervous system is things that are not at a conscious level. We cannot control them, and we're not really aware of them even. But what this does, so for instance, when we're working with this part of ourselves, it's going to take an enormous amount of information and it's going to make assumptions. So the conscious thinking part of us, that's the part of us that's capable of doing critical thought. Critical thinking as far as, well, you know what, let's really think about this. Let's apply some reason to this. And that is a slow process. It's calorie heavy. It costs time. It costs calories. It's something that our ancient ancestors learned not to do because it did not help us to survive. And so just an example is, okay, there's this slender, coiled up creature over here. It's got big fangs and a tail. And maybe I'll think about this, right? Maybe I'll just stop to, well, let's see, it's got this big head. It looks kind of funny. If we were to stop and really critically think about this, it's likely we would be killed by predators and things like that. So the unconscious, right? It's going with this old battle plan, this old plan for survival. And that is, it's better to not critically think. It's better to react quickly because you only have to get unlucky one time. And so this influences every decision that we make. And so the unconscious, it's not capable of critical thinking, but it is capable of doing incredible amounts of information processing seemingly instantaneously. And that is comparing your experiences, all of the memories that you have, all of these things that you've learned. And then suddenly you come out with sort of what we call like a gut reaction or something that my heart is feeling this way. We don't always even know why we feel the way we feel, but that is the unconscious. It's not always clear, but it's going to give you these things called emotions, right? And so emotions, of course, when we say this, oh boy, here comes the emotions thing, right? But really what they are, there's a biological function to your emotions. And there are emotions that you are having right now that you're not aware of. There are feelings. So when those emotions become apparent to your conscious awareness, you experience them as feelings. But what they are is ultimately signals from the unconscious that are there to try to move you towards some kind of an action. And these would be signals that are usually making an assumption. So that's what the unconscious loves to do. It makes assumptions. A lot of times it's right. It's not always right. It's typically going to make the assumption and skew towards the negative, right? Again, if there's this coiled up thing on the rock and you walk closer to it, it's more advantageous for it to assume that this is a dangerous situation. You should step back, as opposed to, hey, this is probably, delicious fruit roll up or, something like that. And so when we apply what we know about how the conscious and the unconscious work together, we can say, okay, so how does this manifest in my daily life, right? This is still happening. The unconscious you is still working with this old game plan. And so when you have instances of that would cause you stress or anxiety, and of course we have access to more information than we've ever had in the past. We're living in a world where there's coiled up, slender, creatures every time you look anywhere, because we know more than anybody ever has in the past, right? We understand these things to be very difficult, complex issues. And so we have the unconscious is making these assumptions, and it will make assumptions about our survivability and our chances at good things happening ultimately. And it's going to say, okay, you need to figure this out. There's so much uncertainty here. You've got to figure this out. And so the strategy that it will employ, there's a part of our brain called the motivational network. It's a part of our unconscious. We can't access it, but it's going to decide what you worry about. And we can't consciously control that. It's just going to decide what you worry about. And it's going to feed you dopamine to try to help you to solve these things, uncertainties, which sometimes you can. Now, a lot of times you can, okay? Did I lock the door, or did I, turn the stove off? Well, I just need to walk over there. But there's a lot of things you can't. We are a lot of times in these states of where the unconscious is trying to push us toward action, an action state, as opposed to a rest and recovery state. And it's doing that because there's a lot of uncertainty. There are things that we're concerned about. And as a result, it's going to influence how you look at any problem-solving situation. It'll influence how you look at all of the decisions that you have at your disposal in life. And so when you don't feel safe, it's often not that, a lot of people won't choose something that is actually advantageous for their overall health and well-being. And so what we want to do with breath is we want to calm this system down. And over time, what's really beautiful, you can start to train the unconscious you to be a little bit more flexible, a little bit more adaptive, a little less, let's jump to the worst conclusions. It's still going to naturally do that. There's no cure to being a human, but you can start to work with this part of yourself. And so when decisions come up and you're aware of this, because no one told me this, when you're aware of this, you can start to say, well, okay, I'm getting messages from my unconscious that I need to take some kind of action. And emotions are scary because they make you feel like this is how it's going to feel. Man, if you don't do something now, it's the end of the world. I think we've all felt this way, right? And that is the voice of your unconscious, is trying to get you to move to action because it feels that this is the best thing for you. You got to understand, it's the same thing that is trying to get you to recoil from the snake, right? Quick, fast movements. Don't think too hard, because if you think too hard about it, you're probably going to die. And this is the same thing that makes us make terrible decisions in the modern world, because in the ancient world, those quick, thoughtless decisions were to our advantage. In the modern world, it's better if you can stay calm, make better decisions. And research continues to show that the decision-making that we actually do make when we're calm is always better. We're less likely to take risks that will end our life. I mean, when you really think about longevity, oftentimes, I don't know how many people I know of died because of risks that they didn't have to take. So there's longevity when we're thinking about, reversing the effects of age or slowing down the effects of aging. But all-cause mortality, my friend, it doesn't care, right? You can die because of so many things. And so getting through this life is so dependent on our decisions that we make each day, both for slowing down the effects of aging, because we know, okay, again, those big three, those big three are happening regularly, the effects of aging are not as bad, right? You're slowing down the effects of aging. You're living, the statistics continue to show those three things. You're going to live a long, healthier life than if you didn't do them. But every single day, people die in car accidents because of just silly things, right? I don't know how many dumb things I've done and I've lived through them to this point, but I don't know how I lived through them. I think there's a million memes on the internet of why men don't live as long as women. I think we're all making silly mistakes, right? We all do silly things that happen in the moment. And it's because we believe we just have to go according to this impulse as opposed to rational, calm thinking, which in just about every case is going to get you a better overall result. So ultimately, if we can learn to understand this is what's happening, right? So just being aware of actually what is happening. It's not the boogeyman. It's not something's wrong with me. It's not them out there. It literally is a part of me that it loves me very much, actually. This part of me loves me very much. It's trying to put me in the best possible situation for thriving and living through this moment, but it's not always right. And so if we can learn to calm that part of us down and keep that part of us and send messages, and in my language of breath and the way that I teach breath work, I compare it to a language. And ultimately, we're able to kind of speak back into this relationship that's within us and say, okay, let's calm down. Okay. It's sure, there are problems in the world. There are problems. And maybe we do need to take some action, but let's calm down enough so that we can take an action after having at least a little bit of rational thought behind it. And that goes for the big decisions, but the more important ones is those little ones we make every single day. That's what's going to get you to that old age, not feeling so old.
In your daily life, can you give us some ideas of certain practices you've implemented to bring that reason, let's say, up when you feel that sort of like internal conflict or that urge for action and rapid movement?
That's a great question. I would say out of all of the clients that I get, that is primarily it, right? Give me something to do when I have these things, right? We need tools for those moments. My answer is usually what I'll do is I'll give some people some techniques that are great for in the moment. But I always, and I'll do that today here. But I also want to reiterate, I'm going to give you some ideas on ways to build a breath practice for every day. Okay, because it's those regular decisions, right? Those regular decisions that overall start to build resilience and more flexibility within this relationship that is you, right? And that's the main focus of the language of breath, is building that language, that better team, right? It's kind of a team building thing. So in the moment, and this is something where before we started, we were talking about my proximity to Indianapolis, Indiana. So one of the programs that I developed was first responders. It's a program called Breathwork Tactics, and we train police, EMTs, dispatch, firefighters in breathwork, specifically related modalities that they can use in the moment and then during regular time. So this is a great, example. So in the moment, we want to always build this certain amount of awareness. It's important to know, okay, I am activated right now. There is a part of me that's giving me a lot of energy, and the strain of that energy is what we experience of stress. I have to withhold, right? I can't just run or just start throwing fists and fight, because that's what my unconscious is saying. Hey, this is the time, right? No, I need to do skilled work. I need to be careful. I have other people's lives on the line, or maybe not first responders, but hey, I need to be careful. I don't want to say the wrong things. I need to make good decisions, right? And so there are simple ones that I think you're going to hear from most people in the breathwork world. One of my favorites is something I call sniff, sniff, poo. Now this one is, I call it sniff, sniff, poo. I'm a dad, and whenever I became a dad, I already had a cheesy sense of humor, but it just got worse. But sniff, sniff, poo, some people call it the physiological sigh. Those are boring people, I think, right? We know that sniff, sniff, poo sounds so much more fun. But anyway, same thing. Ultimately, doing something like that and just maybe doing between 3 and 5. So, and for those who are listening who maybe are not familiar with sniff, sniff, poo, or the physiological sigh or whatever, ultimately what that is, you're going to take 2 sniffs in. The first one is going to be about between 70 and 80% of a full breath in. And then you're going to take the second sniff to fill up to the top. And then you're going to exhale nice and slow through your mouth. And I don't know if you'll be able to hear me do it, but it'll be something like this. And then you exhale, right? And you can do this once, you can do this, 3 to 5 times usually is what most people do when they're really, really overwhelmed. And this is when, for instance, maybe you're emotionally overwhelmed, or maybe you're just stressed out. There's a lot of things happening. It's a really great way to stimulate the vagus nerve, to reduce some of the CO2 buildup, and it mimics sobbing, which is a natural way of calming our system. So it does a lot of things together. Another one that I recommend, and these are ones that I would say you'll hear from most people, is 4-7-8 breathing. 4-7-8 breathing is one that's great just about any time. It works quickly. It sends a message of calm in a very strong way. It's something that you can use without worrying about getting dizzy or without worrying about being activated even more. Because sometimes some techniques will actually, even though they help you to balance, they'll activate your nervous system a little bit more. So 4, 7, 8, you're going to breathe in for 4 seconds. You're going to hold for 7 seconds with very full lungs, and then you exhale for 8 seconds. Typically, this is done between 4 and 8 times. And it was the craziest thing. There was a whole quest in my life because everyone said, do it between 4 and 8 times. And people would ask me, hey, why not do it more than 8 times? Right. And there's a whole quest in my life trying to figure that out, because Dr. Andrew Weil, he's the one who really made this very popular, and 8 times maximum. Ultimately, there is a diminishing returns after 8 repetitions. So if you really want the most out of this technique, you do 4 to 8 times, then you go back into normal breathing or do box breathing or some other breathing style for about a minute. And then you come right back 4 to 8 times and you can go back and forth. This is great for when you're ruminating at night, can't get to sleep, but also whenever you're in a moment of stress. Now, those are 2 out of the lots of different ones. Those are common ones that a lot of people know. In the language of breath, we always add an element of interoceptive awareness. So we always want to try to feel what we're feeling. One of the things that one of the problems I think in breath work is trying to dissociate from the way that we feel. I don't want to feel this way anymore. And that's what led me down a lot of bad paths with drugs and alcohol. We're not trying to replace that. So as you do any breath work technique, and this is very language of breath philosophy here, is you're trying to actually feel what you're feeling. You're not trying to run away from it. And ultimately, you're saying, okay, thank you, unconscious me. Thank you for your concern. We're going to work as a team here. I got to do some conscious thinking now. And we're not running away from the way it feels. We're not trying to suppress anything with breath. But those are sort of things you can do in the moment. But ultimately, the real, I guess, I don't know if the word magic would be appropriate, but it is sort of a magic. The real secret sauce of breath work is learning over time to train yourself and this team that is you, the conscious and unconscious you. And so one very easy way to do that, we have a lot of different exercises in the language of breath that are just basically variations on things that a lot of people already know. But one way to do it is heart resonance frequency breathing every morning and every evening. Now in the Ox app, there's a fantastic, it's a great app for that because it does give you a lot of biofeedback as far as if you're in that state of coherence, right? And the longer you can stay in that, typically, the beauty is that we do have quite a bit of research on this. Sometimes we call it coherence breathing. Sometimes we call it heart resonance frequency breathing. But ultimately, it is that balanced breathing, or you're breathing for each breath, it takes about 10 seconds. So in the Ox app, the one that I like the most is you're breathing in for 4 seconds, you're exhaling for 6 seconds. That's fine. That actually, for most people, is the best place to start, especially because we are generally, most people have a difficulty lengthening their inhale. So, and it's more easy to lengthen the exhale. So 4 in, 6 out is easier to do. It also, could be helping because it's stimulating the vagus nerve a little bit more, lengthening that exhale. But you can also do 5 seconds in, 5 seconds out, 6 seconds in, 6 seconds out. Everyone has a little bit different perfect heart resonance frequency. But as long as you're doing one of those, you just do that and give it time. Don't have to nerd out too much on it. You're training yourself. The research continues to show that you have more flexibility in your nervous system. Your autonomic nervous system is able to upregulate and downregulate more fluidly, as opposed to leaving you in those heightened levels of stress, which have, when we can upregulate and downregulate without really having to think about it too much, right? We've trained ourselves to do that. We're also stimulating that ventral vagal system, so that social engagement system that helps us to, again, make better decisions. It helps us to interact with other people in a better way. And one of the things we don't like, we love to talk about mechanism, but having an active social life, that's when you look at the blue zones, that's one of the most common things you're going to hear is a very active social life. And I think we just want to think about, okay, how can we, change a molecule here or there? Your social life does that for you. It is a beautiful thing. So, in a lot of these communities, you'll see a lot of smoking, a lot of things that we wouldn't associate with living a long, healthy life, but having that active social life is so important. So doing that on a regular basis, every morning, every evening, I call it bookending, the day. that is going to do more for you in the long run than, okay, every time I get stressed out, I do sniff, sniff, poo, 478 or whatever. Although I want people to have those at their disposal, it is so important to have the lifestyle. Again, it comes down to those everyday decisions, those patterns that we create that really change our lives in major ways, both in the short term when it comes to these techniques, but also especially in the long term with regards to longevity.
It's very interesting that I came into conversation with, let's say, maybe a different expectation and angle, which was also like, what are the different physiological aspects we can influence for longevity, maybe, relate to cardiovascular health or immunity or, mental health, we touched on it. And not really thinking about how can we, use breathwork to influence the tiny but, multiple and daily decisions that we make that ultimately, can be, matter of life and death, and on the longer term, have make a substantial difference to the way we feel, the way we live. I think to me, it was a very, enlightening conversation. What I also, take out of it that I found also very interesting is when I started the podcast, I was fairly new to breathwork. I don't have the amount of knowledge and expertise that the guests have. And I find it very interesting to see how certain techniques, like we mentioned, physiological sigh or 478, we talked about this, I think in episode 3, which was for, the management of insomnia, for example. So these are in the end the same techniques. They can be used for different purposes. And I think it just speaks for the power of breathing. And it's not a complicated or it's not rocket science. It's simple things that we can, use on a daily basis that actually make a big difference. We just need to know about them, and we just need to, in a way, start using these. And I think the closing question I would have for you, Jesse, would be, for people who might be new to that, who might, hear the conversation and be like, okay, well, I'll give it a try. How should people get started, and what should they expect in the beginning of their journey? Because I guess they might not see a direct effect, and they might say, okay, well, that's actually not working. I'm going to try something different.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. And I appreciate your reflection on our conversation today. I know that when we talk about longevity, we typically want to focus on specific studies, and we a lot of times parse out information. In the many years that I have been a breath worker and a breath coach, there have been a lot of hopeful research that has come out, and man, we're really excited about this, right? And then later on, it's like, oh, maybe we were reading too much into it. So that's one of the reasons why I hesitate these days, at least, to get into those specifics. And I appreciate you allowing me to talk a lot about how our decisions affect us and those major things that we can do using breath. When it comes to starting in the world of breath work, I do, hey, we are on the Oxa podcast, and I will say I use this device. I think it's a fantastic device. I'm currently using it with some of my athletes now, so I'm really excited to see where that goes. I would say that just like every other decision that you make, every other thing that we've talked about making major changes in life, that it's important to understand that those small decisions that you make lead to bigger things. And when I train my students, so I certify breath workers in the language of breath philosophy. And one of the biggest mistakes that early on breath coaches make is over assigning homework, right? Because, hey, this would be great. And if you did this, this would be great. Oh, and if you did this, oh man. And then they'll have this program that is every minute of every day, you're doing some kind of technique or things like that. And yes, those things would work. This would be a great end goal. But remember that it starts with those little steps, those little victories. Just like when I was talking about, this financial guru and his philosophy, it works better when you set the bar low. And I know no one likes to hear that. Set the bar low? No, I want to set the bar high. But believe me, if you set the bar and say each day, I'm going to dedicate 2 minutes in the morning, 2 minutes in the evening. It won't be long until you're doing 5 or 10 minutes, because you're going to start to say, well, I did 2 minutes. Might as well do 5. I'm here. I've got a little bit of extra time. It's when we try to jump into things face first and we just want to do it all at once. When you go to the weight room and you say, I'm going to lift all the weights, that's whenever we don't really build the habits that build lifelong benefits and success. So I would say go slow, have a good sense of humor with it. Know that, just like with my story, I was so proud of myself for 15 minutes in the gym, and it led to, a whole life of health and wellness, that if you're starting, don't get discouraged. Don't feel like you have to do everything that eventually you'll have total time and desire to do. Just start, and this time next year, you'll be surprised at how far you've come.
Some nice closing words. Thank you so much for your time and for sharing your story and sharing your expertise with us, Jesse. I appreciate it.
It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you for listening to our conversation with Jesse Coomer, where we discuss breathing tools to improve longevity. To learn more about and explore the resources that Jesse mentioned, check out the show notes. If you enjoyed this episode of the Oxa Podcast, subscribe on YouTube or your preferred streaming platform and give us feedback via email using podcast@oxalife.com or in the comment section. Feel free to also share topic suggestions for the next episodes as well as guest recommendations. If you know someone who would benefit from today's conversation, please share the episode with this person. As an additional way to support the show, you can leave us a 5-star review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. It helps us a lot bringing the podcast forward. Thanks again for listening to today's conversation and for your interest in the science of breathing.